The first time Grace Zimmerman heard laughter echo through the dusty streets of Laredo, Texas, she knew it was directed at her. The year was 1878, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the small border town, where cattle drives met railroad commerce, where men smelled of sweat and whiskey, and where a 21-year-old woman who could not read or write was considered less than worthless. She clutched the paper in her hand, the elegant script dancing meaninglessly before her eyes like ants crawling across white sand, and felt her cheeks burn with shame that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat. The shopkeeper had thrust the invoice toward her with impatience, asking her to verify the items listed matched what sat in her basket. Grace had stared at the paper, her mouth going dry, her tongue thick and useless. She had learned long ago to hide her inadequacy, to nod and smile, to pretend she understood the mysterious symbols that others decoded so effortlessly. But today, her deception had failed. "She cannot even read it," the shopkeeper said, not quite under his breath, to the other customers gathered in his establishment. "How does such a woman expect to manage in this world?" A couple of ranch hands snickered. One woman in a fine dress clicked her tongue in disapproval. Grace felt every eye upon her like brands against her skin. She wanted to explain that her parents had died when she was young, that she had been passed from one reluctant relative to another, that no one had ever cared enough to teach her what seemed to come so naturally to everyone else. But explanations would only invite more pity or scorn, neither of which she could bear. She abandoned her basket and fled into the street, nearly colliding with a horse. The rider cursed. She did not look back. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall in public. Grace hurried toward the small boarding house where she rented a cramped room on the second floor, earning her keep by washing linens and scrubbing floors for the proprietress, Mrs. Henderson. The boarding house sat at the edge of town, where Laredo began to surrender to the wild Texas landscape. Grace climbed the exterior stairs to her room, grateful that Mrs. Henderson was occupied elsewhere and would not see her distress. Once inside, she finally allowed herself to cry, pressing her face into her thin pillow to muffle the sounds. She had been orphaned at 8 years old when cholera swept through the wagon train her family had joined, heading west from Missouri in search of better prospects. Her parents and younger brother had all perished within days of each other. Grace survived, though she sometimes wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. The wagon master had deposited her with distant cousins in Texas who had not wanted another mouth to feed. They put her to work immediately, and when she asked about schooling, they laughed. Education was wasted on girls, especially poor orphan girls who ought to be grateful for a roof over their heads and food in their bellies. By the time she was old enough to understand what she had been denied, it seemed too late to remedy it. She worked wherever she could, always moving from one situation to another, never quite belonging anywhere. Laredo was simply the latest stop in a long journey of loneliness. The sun was setting when Grace finally rose from her bed, splashed water on her face from the basin, and tried to compose herself. Tomorrow would bring fresh humiliation, she was certain. Word would spread through Laredo that the boarding house girl was illiterate. People would whisper and stare. Some might even refuse to let her handle their laundry or clean their rooms, fearful that her ignorance was somehow contagious. She was preparing for bed when she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs outside, then a knock at her door. Grace froze. It was unusual for anyone to seek her out, especially at this hour. "Miss Zimmerman." The voice was deep, masculine, unfamiliar. She cracked the door open, keeping the chain latched. In the dim light of the hallway lamp, she could make out the silhouette of a very large man. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the narrow doorway. His hair was long and dark, falling past his shoulders, and an unkempt beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin and leather, the clothing of someone who spent more time in the wilderness than in civilization. "Who are you?" Grace asked, her heart hammering. "Name is Garrett Grayson," he said. "I was in the general store today. I heard what happened." Grace felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her. "I do not need your pity. Good, because I am not offering any." His voice was matter of fact, not unkind. "I am offering to teach you." She blinked, certain she had misheard. "Teach me what? To read and write." "Every single night, if that is what it takes." Grace stared at him, searching for the cruelty behind the offer, the trick that would make sense of this stranger's impossible proposition. "Why would you do that?" Garrett Grayson shifted his weight, and she noticed he held his hat in his hands, worrying the brim with fingers that looked strong enough to snap wood. "I spent 15 years in these mountains and plains, trapping and hunting. I know what it is like to be alone, to feel like the world has no place for you. When I finally came down from the high country, I could barely talk to people anymore. An old Mexican trader took pity on me, taught me Spanish, reminded me how to be human again. He said the only way to repay a kindness is to pass it forward, so that is what I aim to do." "You are a stranger," Grace said, though her heart had begun to beat with something other than fear, something that felt dangerously like hope. "That is true. But I will come to the boarding house parlor every evening at 7. Mrs. Henderson will be there to chaperone if that makes you more comfortable. All you have to do is show up and be willing to learn. No money required, no obligation beyond that." Grace wanted to believe him. She wanted it so desperately that it frightened her. "Why me? There must be others who need help." For the first time, something like a smile touched his bearded face. "Because you are the one who ran out of that store today. You are the one who refused to cry where they could see you. That takes strength, and strength is worth cultivating." Before she could respond, he placed his hat back on his head and turned to descend the stairs, his heavy boots echoing in the quiet evening. Grace stood in her doorway, watching him disappear into the gathering darkness, and wondered if she had imagined the entire encounter. But the next evening at 7, Garrett Grayson appeared in the boarding house parlor with a slate, chalk, and several books tucked under one massive arm. Mrs. Henderson, who had apparently been informed of the arrangement, directed him to a table near the lamp, and then busied herself with needlework in the corner, providing the necessary propriety. Grace descended the stairs slowly, half expecting this to be some elaborate prank. But Garrett simply stood when he saw her, gestured to the chair across from him, and waited patiently for her to sit. "We will start with the alphabet," he said, his deep voice gentle. 26 letters, each with a sound. Put them together and you have words. Put words together and you have sentences. Put sentences together and you have stories, ideas, knowledge. Everything you have been denied, we will unlock together." His large hands, scarred and calloused from years of hard living, held the chalk with surprising delicacy. He drew the first letter on the slate. "This is A," he said. "It sounds like the beginning of apple or afternoon. Try saying it." Grace felt foolish, like a child, though she was a grown woman. But something in Garrett's steady gaze told her he would not judge her, would not mock her fumbling attempts, so she tried. "A. Good. Now copy the shape of it." Her first attempt was shaky, the lines uneven. Garrett did not comment on its imperfection, only nodded and showed her the next letter. They worked through the alphabet slowly, and Grace discovered that learning was both harder and more exhilarating than she had imagined. Each letter was a small victory, a piece of a vast puzzle finally clicking into place. When the clock struck 9, Garrett set down the chalk. "That is enough for tonight. You did well." "I barely managed 5 letters," Grace protested. "5 more than you knew this morning." He rose, gathering his materials. "Same time tomorrow," she nodded, not trusting her voice. As he left, Mrs. Henderson looked up from her needlework with an approving expression. "That is a good man," the older woman said. "Garrett Grayson came to Laredo 3 months ago with a string of beaver pelts worth a small fortune. He bought a plot of land north of town, built himself a cabin with his own 2 hands. Keeps to himself mostly, but folks say he is honest and decent. You could do worse for a teacher." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "He is only being kind. Kindness is how most good things begin," Mrs. Henderson replied cryptically. Over the following weeks, Grace's education progressed in increments that felt both frustratingly slow and miraculously swift. Garrett proved to be a patient teacher, never raising his voice when she struggled, always ready to explain something a different way if her confusion persisted. They moved from letters to simple words, from words to short sentences. The first time she successfully read an entire sentence from one of his books, Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "The cat sat on the mat." Such simple words, yet they represented a door opening to a world she had been locked out of her entire life. Garrett's stern face softened into something approaching pride. "You are a natural learner. You have been held back by circumstance, not ability." As the lessons continued, Grace became increasingly aware of her teacher as a man, not merely an instructor. She noticed the way lamplight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, the way his powerful hands moved with precision and care, the way his blue eyes warmed when she made progress. She found herself looking forward to 7 in the evening with an eagerness that had little to do with conjugating verbs. For his part, Garrett seemed to enjoy their time together as much as she did. He began staying later, talking with her after the formal lesson ended, telling her stories of his years in the mountains, of grizzly bears and thunderstorms, of winter nights so cold that whiskey froze in the bottle. Grace listened, fascinated by this man who had chosen solitude and now seemed to be choosing something else entirely. "Why did you leave the mountains?" she asked one night in early October, when the Texas heat had finally begun to relent. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. 15 years is a long time to live with only your own thoughts for company. I started forgetting what I was working toward, why I had chosen that life in the first place. One morning I woke up in my tent and could not remember my mother's face. That frightened me more than any wild animal ever had. I realized if I stayed any longer I would lose myself completely. So I came down, sold my furs, and decided to build something permanent. A home, maybe. A life that mattered beyond mere survival. "Have you found it?" Grace asked softly. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I believe I am starting to." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat pointedly from her corner, and the moment broke. Garrett gathered his books, bid them both good night, and left Grace with a racing heart and a confusion of feelings she did not quite know how to name. By November, Grace could read simple newspaper articles and write short letters. Her world had expanded in ways she had never imagined possible. She no longer feared trips to the general store. When the shopkeeper handed her an invoice now, she could read every word, verify every item, and sign her own name with a flourish that filled her with quiet triumph. But more than the practical benefits, reading had given her access to stories and ideas that made her understand. She was part of something larger than her small, difficult life. She devoured every book Garrett brought her, from adventure tales to poetry to philosophical essays that challenged her understanding of the world. And through it all, Garrett remained steadfast in his dedication to her education. He never missed a lesson, never showed impatience with her questions, never made her feel less than worthy of his time and effort. It was on a cool evening in late November when everything changed between them. They had just finished a lesson on complex sentence structure, and Grace was packing away her writing materials when Garrett reached across the table and gently caught her hand. "Grace," he said, and her name in his deep voice sent shivers down her spine. "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her heart suddenly pounding. Mrs. Henderson had stepped out to check on something in the kitchen, leaving them momentarily alone. "What is it?" Grace whispered. "When I first saw you in that store, running from those cruel people, I felt something I had not felt in years. Anger, yes, but also a fierce protectiveness. I wanted to shield you from their mockery, to show them the strength I could already see in you. But as these weeks have passed, as I have watched you grow and learn and blossom into your full potential, what I feel has become something else entirely." He paused, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I have fallen in love with you, Grace, deeply and completely." Grace felt as though all the air had left the room. She stared at their joined hands, his so large and weathered, hers small and pale in comparison, and felt the truth of her own heart surge forward like a river breaking through a dam. "I love you too," she said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "I have tried not to. I told myself you were only being kind, that a man like you could never truly want someone like me. But every evening when you walk through that door, my heart sings. Every time you smile at my progress, I feel like I could conquer the world. You have given me so much more than literacy, Garrett. You have given me back my dignity, my hope, my future." Garrett stood, pulling her gently to her feet, and cupped her face in his large hands. "You were always worthy, Grace. Always. I merely helped you see what was there all along." He kissed her then, a soft press of lips that quickly deepened into something more passionate. Grace melted into his embrace, feeling safe and cherished in a way she had never experienced. His arms encircled her like protective walls against all the cruelty the world had shown her. Mrs. Henderson's footsteps in the hallway made them spring apart, both flushed and breathless. The older woman took one look at them and smiled knowingly. "I suppose lessons may take on a different character now," she said with amusement. "But I trust you both to maintain propriety under my roof." "Yes, madam," Garrett said, clearing his throat. "Though I should mention that my intentions toward Miss Zimmerman are entirely honorable. With your permission and hers, I would like to begin courting her properly." Mrs. Henderson looked at Grace, who nodded eagerly. "Then you have my blessing. But the door to this parlor stays open, and I will be present for all visits." "Understood," Garrett agreed. What followed was the happiest period of Grace's life. Garrett courted her with old-fashioned devotion, bringing her wildflowers from the prairie, taking her on chaperoned walks through Laredo, sharing meals at the boarding house under Mrs. Henderson's watchful eye. Their lessons continued, but now they were punctuated with stolen glances, soft touches, whispered endearments. Grace learned that Garrett was 32 years old, that he had been born in Ohio to a family of farmers, that he had gone west as a young man seeking adventure, and found instead a vast loneliness that had taken years to overcome. He was gentle despite his imposing size, thoughtful despite his limited formal education, honorable despite years spent beyond the reach of civilization and its rules. She also learned that he was building not just a cabin on his land, but a vision of a future. He had planted fruit trees, dug a well, constructed a barn for animals he planned to acquire. He spoke of his dreams tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as Grace encouraged him. "I want to build something lasting," he told her one December evening as they sat together in the parlor, her reading aloud from a book of poetry while he whittled a piece of wood into a delicate bird. "A home, a family, a place where people feel welcome and safe. I spent too many years running from connection. Now I want to run toward it." Grace set down her book. "That sounds wonderful." He looked up from his whittling, his blue eyes intense in the lamplight. "I want you to be part of it, Grace. I want you to share that life with me if you will have me." Her breath caught. "Garrett, are you asking me to marry you?" "I am asking if you would consider it," he said carefully. "I know we have not been courting long. I know I am not a wealthy man, not refined or educated in the ways of society, but I love you with everything I am. I will spend every day of my life making sure you never feel small or unworthy again. I will protect you, provide for you, cherish you until my last breath." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Garrett, I will marry you. I would be honored to be your wife." He set aside his whittling and drew her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made Mrs. Henderson clear her throat loudly from across the room. They broke apart, laughing, and Garrett produced from his pocket a simple gold band. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "The only thing of value my family had. My mother gave it to me before I went west, told me to save it for a woman who was strong enough to match my spirit. I believe that woman is you." Grace held out her hand, trembling with emotion, and Garrett slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting all these years just for her. They were married 3 weeks later, just before Christmas, in a simple ceremony at the small Methodist church in Laredo. Mrs. Henderson stood as Grace's witness, and Garrett's only real friend in town, a Mexican rancher named Miguel Torres, served as his. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and Garrett wore clean buckskins and a new shirt. His hair was pulled back, his beard neatly trimmed, and Grace thought she had never seen a more handsome man. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed her with a tenderness that belied his powerful frame, and Grace felt her heart overflow with happiness she had never imagined possible. They spent their wedding night at Garrett's cabin, which he had prepared with care. The interior was rustic but clean, with a large fireplace, sturdy furniture he had built himself, and a bed covered in thick quilts. Garrett carried Grace over the threshold, a tradition he insisted upon despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of walking. "Let me do this," he murmured against her hair. "Let me show you that you are precious to me." That night, he made love to her with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. He treated her like something sacred, learning her body with the same patience he had shown when teaching her the alphabet. Grace discovered that intimacy with someone you loved was nothing like the crude jokes and whispered warnings she had heard from other women. It was beautiful and profound, a joining of more than just bodies. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, Garrett traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "I used to think the mountains were the most beautiful thing I would ever see," he said softly. "I was wrong." Grace laughed, turning to kiss him. "You are hopelessly romantic for a mountain man." "Only with you," he replied, pulling her closer. "Only ever with you." Their first months of marriage were not without challenges. Grace had to learn to cook properly, as her experience had been limited to simple boarding house fare. Garrett was patient with her burnt biscuits and over-salted stew, eating everything she prepared with solemn determination and offering gentle suggestions for improvement. She also had to adjust to the isolation of their cabin, which sat a good distance from Laredo proper. After years of living in the boarding house, surrounded by the constant noise and bustle of other residents, the quiet of the prairie was both peaceful and unsettling. Some days the silence felt oppressive, broken only by the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk. But Garrett was always there, steady and strong, making her laugh with stories from his trapping days, holding her close when loneliness threatened to overwhelm her, reminding her that building a life together took time and patience. Grace continued her education, devouring every book Garrett could acquire from the general store or borrow from the few families in the area who owned any. She particularly loved novels, losing herself in stories of adventure and romance that transported her far beyond the Texas plains. Garrett would often find her curled up in the rocking chair he had made for her, completely absorbed in a story, and would simply smile and go about his work quietly so as not to disturb her. In the evenings, she began teaching him more advanced reading and writing skills. Garrett could manage basic literacy, but his years in the wilderness had left gaps in his education. Together they studied grammar and history, mathematics and geography. They became students together, partners in learning as well as life. "We are quite a pair," Grace said one night, laughing as they puzzled over a particularly complex mathematical problem from one of Garrett's books. "Neither of us had proper schooling, yet here we are, determined to educate ourselves." "Intelligence and education are not the same thing," Garrett replied, solving the problem with a decisive flourish. "You are one of the smartest people I know, Grace, regardless of how many years you spent in a classroom." Spring came to the Texas prairie in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. Garrett began working his land in earnest, planting corn and beans, building pens for the chickens and pigs he planned to purchase. Grace established a garden near the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the soil with the same determination she had brought to learning her letters. They also began making more frequent trips to Lerdo for supplies and socializing. Grace had been nervous about facing the townspeople again, especially those who had mocked her in the general store. But she held her head high, secure in Garrett's love and in her own hard-won abilities. The first time she walked into that store as Mrs. Grayson, able to read every label and sign, able to review her invoice with competence, the shopkeeper had the grace to look ashamed. Several of the women who had whispered about her now greeted her politely, perhaps recognizing that she had not only overcome her illiteracy, but had also married one of the most respected men in the region. Grace accepted their politeness with measured grace, but she did not forget their earlier cruelty. She saved her warmth for those who had been kind when she was at her lowest, like Mrs. Henderson, who remained a dear friend. It was in early summer that Grace began to suspect she was with child. She waited until she was certain before telling Garrett, wanting to surprise him with the news. She chose a beautiful June evening when the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and they were sitting together on the porch he had built, watching the stars emerge. "Garrett," she said softly, taking his hand, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her immediately, alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "More than all right," she assured him. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Garrett simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a smile broke across his face like sunrise, transforming his rugged features into something radiant with joy. He let out a whoop of delight that probably carried all the way to Lerdo and swept Grace into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "Careful, you will make me dizzy," she cried. He set her down gently, immediately solicitous. "I am sorry. I should be more careful." "Are you well? Do you need anything? Should you be sitting down?" Grace laughed at his sudden anxiousness. "I am fine, Garrett. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am strong and I have you to take care of me. Everything will be well." He knelt before her, pressing his face against her still flat belly. "A child," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child. I will build them such a good life, Grace. I promise you, they will grow up knowing they are loved and wanted, knowing they have a place in this world." Grace stroked his long hair, her heart full. "I know you will. We both will." The months of her pregnancy passed in a haze of preparation and anticipation. Garrett threw himself into improving the cabin, adding a second room for the nursery, ensuring every crack was sealed against winter drafts. He carved a beautiful cradle from oak, working on it for hours in the evenings, his large hands shaping the wood with infinite care. Grace prepared tiny clothes, learning to sew from Mrs. Henderson, who visited frequently and seemed almost as excited about the baby as the expectant parents themselves. The older woman had never had children of her own and had come to regard Grace as something like a daughter. Miguel Torres and his wife, Rosa, also became regular visitors. Rosa, who had 5 children of her own, was a font of advice and reassurance. She taught Grace about childbirth, what to expect and how to prepare, speaking frankly in a way that Grace appreciated. The 4 of them often shared meals, and Grace cherished these evenings of friendship and laughter. As her belly grew, Garrett became increasingly protective. He insisted she avoid any strenuous work, took over all the heavy lifting, hovered anxiously whenever she so much as grimaced. Grace found his concern both touching and occasionally frustrating. "I am not made of glass," she told him one evening in late autumn, when he had practically carried her to bed despite her insistence that she was perfectly capable of walking. "I know," he said, tucking the quilts around her with exaggerated care. "But you are carrying the most precious thing in the world to me besides yourself. Let me fuss over you. It makes me feel useful." She softened immediately, reaching up to cup his bearded cheek. "You are far more than useful, Garrett Grayson. You are my whole heart." He turned his face to kiss her palm. "And you are mine." Their son was born on a cold January night in 1880, entering the world with a lusty cry that filled Garrett with fierce pride and overwhelming terror in equal measure. Rosa served as midwife, guiding Grace through the long hours of labor with patient competence, while Garrett paced outside like a caged mountain lion until Rosa finally took pity on him and allowed him into the bedroom. When he saw his son for the first time, held in Grace's exhausted but triumphant arms, Garrett wept openly. He knelt beside the bed, one massive finger tracing the baby's tiny face, and Grace saw in his eyes all the love and wonder she felt reflected back at her. "He is perfect," Garrett whispered. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed this during the pregnancy, considering various options. Grace spoke the name they had agreed upon. "I thought we might call him James after your father." Garrett's eyes filled with fresh tears. His father had died years ago, long before Garrett had begun to build this new life. "James Grayson," he said, testing the name. "Yes, that is perfect." Little James proved to be a healthy, happy baby who quickly became the center of their world. Garrett was a devoted father, taking to parenthood with the same wholehearted commitment he brought to everything. He would walk the floor with James for hours when the baby was fussy, sing to him in a surprisingly pleasant baritone, change his diapers without complaint. Grace discovered depths of love she had not known existed. She loved Garrett, of course, deeply and passionately. But the love she felt for her son was different, something primal and fierce that transformed her understanding of herself. She would protect this child with her life, would move heaven and earth to ensure he never felt unwanted or unworthy as she had. As James grew from infant to toddler, their cabin filled with noise and laughter. He was an active child, curious about everything, fearless in a way that gave Grace heart palpitations. Garrett encouraged his son's adventurous spirit while teaching him to be careful, to respect the natural world and its dangers. Grace continued her own education, now reading to James every night, determined that her son would grow up surrounded by books and stories. She taught him his letters as soon as he was old enough to hold a pencil, delighting in watching him form his first wobbly alphabet. "You are an excellent teacher," Garrett told her one evening, watching as she patiently guided James's small hand. "Much better than I ever was." "That is not true," Grace protested. "You taught me everything I know." "I taught you the mechanics," Garrett corrected. "But you gave yourself the gift of loving learning. That is something that cannot be taught, only nurtured, and you are nurturing that same love in our son." Their life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following years. Garrett's farm prospered, providing them with a modest but secure income. They added onto the cabin twice, creating more space as their needs grew. Grace established herself in Laredo as a woman of education and capability, someone other mothers came to for advice about teaching their own children. When James was 4, Grace became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1884, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made James hide under his bed in delighted terror. They named her Caroline, after Grace's mother, reclaiming a piece of the family Grace had lost so long ago. Caroline was as different from James as could be imagined. Where he was boisterous and adventurous, she was quiet and contemplative. Where he climbed everything in sight, she sat contentedly with her dolls, creating elaborate stories that she would narrate to anyone who would listen. Garrett loved both his children equally but differently, recognizing and honoring their individual natures. He taught James to hunt and track, while also teaching Caroline to identify plants and birds. He read to both of them every night, his deep voice bringing stories to life. Grace watched her husband with their children and fell in love with him anew every day. The rough mountain man who had offered to teach an illiterate woman to read had transformed into this patient, loving father who treated his family like the most precious treasure in the world. But life was not without its challenges. In the summer of 1885, a terrible drought struck the Texas plains. Crops withered in the fields. The creek that ran through their property slowed to a trickle and then dried up entirely. Garrett dug deeper into their well, working until his hands bled and his muscles screamed, determined to secure water for his family and animals. Grace rationed their food supplies carefully, making every pound of flour and every jar of preserved vegetables stretch as far as possible. She sewed patches on patches, made soap from every scrap of fat, wasted nothing. They were leaner that winter than they had been in years, but they survived, sustained by their love for each other and their determination to protect their children. When the rains finally came in the spring of 1886, Garrett stood in their field and let the water soak him to the skin, laughing with relief. Grace joined him, pulling the children out into the downpour, all of them dancing in the mud like wild things. That night, after the children were asleep, Garrett held Grace close in their bed. "I used to think I was strong because I could survive alone in the wilderness," he said softly. "But true strength is surviving together, facing hardship as a family and coming through it intact. You have made me stronger than I ever was in those mountains, Grace." She kissed him deeply. "We have made each other stronger. That is what love does. It multiplies our strengths and divides our burdens." As their children grew, Grace and Garrett made education a cornerstone of their household. Grace had taught herself so many subjects over the years that she was more than qualified to run a small school. When several neighboring families expressed interest in having her teach their children as well, she agreed. 3 days a week, their cabin became a schoolhouse, with children ranging from 5 to 15 gathering around the large table Garrett had built for the purpose. Grace taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography with the passion of someone who knew firsthand the transformative power of education. Garrett supported her in this endeavor, sometimes teaching the older boys practical skills like carpentry and animal husbandry, while Grace focused on academics. Together, they created an education system that valued both book learning and practical knowledge, both intellectual growth and character development. James thrived in this environment, devouring knowledge with an appetite that reminded Grace of herself. By the time he was 10, he was reading books that challenged even her comprehension, asking questions about science and philosophy that kept her up at night researching answers. Caroline was equally bright but more interested in creative pursuits. She wrote stories constantly, filling slate after slate with tales of adventure and romance, illustrated with careful drawings. Garrett built her a special desk by the window where the light was best, and Grace supplied her with paper whenever they could afford it. The years passed in a blur of planting and harvest, of lessons and laughter, of quiet evenings on the porch and busy days filled with the work of sustaining a life. Grace and Garrett grew older together, silver threading through their hair, lines deepening around their eyes, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by shared hardship and sweetened by shared joy. In 1890, when Grace was 33 and Garrett was 44, they welcomed their final child, another son they named Thomas. James was already 13 and Caroline was 6, old enough to help care for their baby brother. The cabin rang with noise and chaos, and Grace sometimes felt overwhelmed by the demands of 3 children, a household and a school. But every night, when the children were finally asleep and she and Garrett sat together in the quiet darkness, she felt nothing but gratitude. This life they had built from nothing more than a humiliating moment in a general store and a mountain man's unexpected kindness was more than she had ever dared to dream possible. "You ever regret it?" she asked Garrett one night when Thomas was about 6 months old and she was feeling particularly exhausted. "All of this. You could have stayed in your mountains, alone and free. Instead, you tied yourself to a woman who could not even read, and now you are raising 3 children in a 2-bedroom cabin." Garrett turned to her, his blue eyes still as piercing as they had been when he first knocked on her boarding house door. "Grace Grayson, you listened to me. Every single day of my life before I met you was empty. I filled it with movement and activity, but it was hollow at the core. You did not trap me. You freed me. You gave me purpose and meaning. You gave me a family, a home, a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive. How could I possibly regret the greatest blessing I have ever known?" She kissed him then, pouring into it all the love and gratitude that words could never fully express. They had started with letters on a slate, with patient lessons in a boarding house parlor. They had built from that foundation an entire world. As the 1890s progressed, their children continued to flourish. James, at 16, was already talking about attending university, an aspiration that filled Grace with both pride and trepidation. She wanted him to have every opportunity she had been denied, but the thought of him leaving home frightened her. Garrett, ever practical, began setting aside money for James's education. "He is bright enough to be anything he wants to be," Garrett told Grace. "A doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. We will make it happen, no matter what sacrifices are required." Caroline, at 12, showed remarkable talent as a writer. Several of her stories had been published in regional magazines, earning small sums that she saved religiously. She dreamed of becoming a novelist, of seeing her name on the spine of a real book. Grace encouraged this dream, remembering how books had opened the world to her. Young Thomas, at 6, was still finding his way, but he showed signs of inheriting his father's love for the outdoors and his mother's intellectual curiosity. He collected insects and rocks, studied them with intense focus, asked endless questions about how things worked. Grace sometimes looked at her 3 children and marveled at how different they all were, how uniquely themselves. She and Garrett had given them a foundation of love and education, but they were building their own lives upon it, becoming people neither parent could have predicted or controlled. In 1896, James did indeed leave for university, winning a scholarship to study medicine in Houston. The day they saw him off on the train from Laredo was one of the hardest of Grace's life. She clung to her tall, serious son and whispered, "Remember where you came from. Remember that education is a gift, not a right. Use it to help people the way your father helped me." James hugged her tightly. "I will, Mama, I promise." Garrett shook his son's hand, pulling him in for a brief masculine embrace. "Make us proud, son, but more importantly, make yourself proud." As the train pulled away, Grace wept against Garrett's chest. He held her, his own eyes suspiciously bright, and they stood on the platform long after the train had disappeared from view. Life without James was strange at first. The cabin felt emptier despite Caroline and Thomas still filling it with their noise and energy. But letters arrived regularly, full of James's experiences and discoveries, and Grace took comfort in knowing her son was thriving. Caroline, at 16, was already receiving interest from young men in Laredo, but she showed little inclination toward courtship. "I have stories to write, Mama," she would say when Grace gently suggested she might want to attend a social gathering. "Romance can wait." Grace, remembering her own late start at love, did not push. "Just do not wait too long," she advised. "Love is worth making time for when the right person comes along." Thomas, at 12, was showing signs of becoming as large and strong as his father. He helped Garrett with all the farm work now, learning the rhythms of the land and the animals. Father and son would spend entire days together, working in companionable silence broken by occasional conversation. Grace loved watching them, seeing how Garrett passed his knowledge and values to their youngest child. In 1898, Grace and Garrett celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a surprise party, inviting neighbors and friends from all over the region. Mrs. Henderson, now quite elderly but still sharp as a tack, attended and gave a speech about how she had known from the first night that Grace and Garrett were meant to be together. "I have seen many things in my years," the old woman said, her voice wavering but strong. "But I have rarely seen 2 people as perfectly matched as these 2. They built each other up when the world tried to tear them down. That is what love should be." Garrett stood and pulled Grace to her feet, holding her close as their friends and family applauded. 20 years ago, I was a lonely man who thought teaching a woman to read was a simple kindness. I had no idea I was really inviting the love of my life to transform my entire world. Grace, you are my greatest adventure, my truest companion, my deepest joy. Here is to 20 more years, and then 20 after that, and as many more as God grants us." Grace kissed him before all their guests, no longer the shy, humiliated girl who had fled a general store in tears. She was a woman who knew her worth, who had built a life of purpose and meaning, who loved fiercely and was loved in return. "To forever," she whispered against his lips. "To every night, every day, every moment together." The new century arrived with great fanfare and speculation about what modern marvels it would bring. James finished medical school and returned to Laredo to establish his practice, wanting to serve the community that had raised him. He married a kind, intelligent woman named Sarah, a teacher who shared his values and his commitment to service. Caroline finally did fall in love with a journalist who recognized and celebrated her talent. They married when she was 23, and she continued writing under her maiden name, determined to make her mark on the world of literature. Her first novel was published in 1903 to favorable reviews, and Grace held the book in her hands with tears streaming down her face, thinking of the little girl who had told such elaborate stories with her dolls. Thomas, at 18, surprised everyone by announcing his intention to become a veterinarian. He left for school in 1904, following his older brother's path to higher education. Garrett and Grace were alone in their cabin for the first time since James's birth, 24 years earlier. The quiet was disorienting at first. Grace wandered through the empty rooms, missing the chaos of children, feeling unmoored. But Garrett gently reminded her that this was not an ending, merely a new beginning. "We raised 3 good humans," he told her. "We gave them roots and wings. Now we get to enjoy watching them soar while we build our own life again, just the 2 of us." Grace discovered he was right. With the children grown and gone, she and Garrett rediscovered each other in new ways. They took trips they had never had time for before, visiting San Antonio and Austin, even traveling as far as New Orleans. They read books together late into the night, discussing ideas and sharing perspectives. They made love with the unhurried pleasure of people who knew each other's bodies as well as their own. Grace also returned to teaching more seriously, establishing a proper school in Laredo with the support of the town council. She became known throughout the region as an exceptional educator, and parents competed to get their children into her classes. She never forgot where she had come from, and she had a particular soft spot for students who struggled, who needed extra patience and encouragement. Garrett continued working their land, now with hired help as age made the physical labor more challenging. But he still rose every morning, still walked his property with satisfaction, still found joy in the simple act of nurturing growing things. Their grandchildren began arriving in 1906, when James and Sarah welcomed a daughter. Over the next decade, Grace and Garrett were blessed with 7 grandchildren in total, each one bringing fresh delight into their lives. The cabin, expanded yet again, filled with noise and chaos during family visits, and Grace reveled in every moment. In 1918, Garrett fell ill with pneumonia. Grace nursed him through it with fierce determination, refusing to let him surrender to the weakness in his lungs. She read to him constantly, reminded him of all the reasons he had to keep fighting, held his hand through the long, feverish nights. "You cannot leave me," she whispered during the worst of it, when his breathing was so labored she feared every breath would be his last. "We have a deal, remember. Forever. Every night, every day, every moment together. I will not release you from that promise." Garrett, even in his delirium, squeezed her hand, and slowly, stubbornly, he recovered. By spring, he was back on his feet, thinner and weaker than before but alive and determined to continue living fully. "You are a fierce woman, Grace Grayson," he told her when he was well enough to sit on the porch again, enjoying the warm sunshine. "You fought death for me and won." "Death will have to wait," Grace replied, settling into the rocking chair beside his. "We still have too much living to do." And they did. They saw their children's successes and supported them through failures. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin having children of their own. They celebrated anniversaries and holidays, birthdays and achievements. They read thousands of books together, discussing everything from philosophy to poetry. They walked their land hand in hand, two people who had found in each other the home they had always sought. In 1928, on their 50th wedding anniversary, their entire family gathered at the cabin for a massive celebration. 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren filled the property with love and laughter. Grace, at 71, looked at Garrett at 72 and saw not an old man but the powerful mountain man who had once promised to teach her every single night. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked him quietly as their family celebrated around them. "When you knocked on my door in that boarding house all those years ago, did you have any idea we would build all of this?" Garrett smiled, the expression crinkling the deeply weathered skin around his eyes. "I imagined I might help a woman learn to read. I never imagined I would find my soulmate, raise a family, build a dynasty of love and learning. You have exceeded every dream I ever dared to have, Grace." She leaned into him, fitting against his side as perfectly as she had 50 years earlier. "We did it together. That is the secret. We were both lost and alone until we found each other. And then we were found." James, as the eldest child, stood to give a speech. At 48, he was a respected doctor with silver in his hair and his father's solid presence. "My parents taught us many things," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering. "They taught us to read and write, to work hard, to value education and integrity. But the most important thing they taught us was how to love. Really love, with commitment and patience and unwavering faith in each other. My father saw past my mother's circumstance to the brilliant woman beneath. My mother saw past my father's rough exterior to the gentle heart within. They built each other up, and in doing so, they built all of us. We are the legacy of their love, and it is a legacy we carry forward with pride." Grace wept, and Garrett held her close, and their family surrounded them with embraces and affirmations of love. It was, Grace thought, as perfect a moment as any life could hold. They had several more good years together. Garrett's health gradually declined, age catching up with his once powerful body. He moved more slowly, tired more easily, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for Grace never wavered. Grace herself was slowing down, her joints aching, her eyesight dimming despite the spectacles she now wore. But every night, they still sat together on their porch when weather permitted, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in glorious colors. And every night, Garrett would take Grace's hand and say, "Tell me a story." And Grace would weave tales of their life together, of the frightened girl who could not read and the lonely man who offered to teach her, of the love that had grown between them like a tree planted in good soil, roots deep and branches wide. She spoke of their children and grandchildren, of struggles overcome and joys celebrated, of 53 years of marriage that had transformed them both beyond recognition. Garrett died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1931, with Grace beside him as she had been for more than half a century. He simply went to bed one night, kissed her good night as he always did, whispered that he loved her, and never woke up. Grace knew immediately when she woke at dawn and reached for him. His body was cool, his face peaceful, his suffering finally ended. She lay beside him for a long time, holding his hand, remembering every moment they had shared. She did not weep yet. The tears would come later. For now, she simply honored the man who had given her everything. "Thank you," she whispered to him, "for seeing me when I was invisible, for teaching me when everyone else thought I was unteachable, for loving me when I thought I was unlovable. You gave me the world, Garrett Grayson. I will carry you in my heart until we meet again." She lived 2 more years without him, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still teaching occasionally, still reading voraciously. But everyone could see that part of her had gone with Garrett. She spoke of him constantly, finding him in every sunset, every book, every quiet moment. Grace Grayson died in her sleep in the summer of 1933 in the cabin Garrett had built with his own hands. She was 76 years old. Her children found her in her rocking chair on the porch, a book open in her lap, a slight smile on her face, as though she had just read something that pleased her. They buried her beside Garrett on the hill overlooking their land, under an oak tree they had planted together decades earlier. The headstones were simple but eloquent. Garrett's read, "He taught with patience and loved without condition." Grace's read, "She learned with courage and loved without limit." Their great-granddaughter, who would grow up to become a teacher herself, would later write about them in a family history. She described how a mountain man had seen a woman being mocked in a general store and had made a decision that changed not just 2 lives but generations. She wrote about how education and love had intertwined to create a legacy that continued long after both original participants were gone. "My great-grandmother always said that learning to read gave her access to the world," the great-granddaughter wrote. But learning to love gave her access to herself. And teaching others, both to read and to love, became her greatest joy and her most lasting contribution. She and my great-grandfather proved that it is never too late to learn, never too late to love, never too late to build something beautiful from the ashes of shame and loneliness. The cabin still stood decades later, preserved by the family as a monument to Grace and Garrett. Visitors could see the slate where Grace had learned her first letters, the books they had read together, the cradle Garrett had carved for their firstborn. They could walk the land that had sustained the family for generations, see the oak tree that shaded 2 graves and represented 2 lives so beautifully intertwined that even death could not fully separate them. And on quiet evenings, when the wind moved through the grass and the last light painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, people swore they could feel the presence of the mountain man and his beloved wife, still together, still learning, still loving after all these years. Their story had become legend in Laredo, told and retold, a reminder that the greatest adventures often begin with a single act of unexpected kindness, and that love, real love, has the power to transform everything it touches. The town had long since forgotten the moment when Grace Zimmerman had stood humiliated in a general store, unable to read a simple invoice. But they remembered Grace Grayson, the exceptional teacher who had educated hundreds of children. They remembered Garrett Grayson, the mountain man who had helped build a community through his quiet strength and unwavering integrity. And most of all, they remembered the love story that had begun with the simple promise, "Then I will teach her every single night." It was a promise Garrett had kept until his last breath, and Grace had honored until hers. Together, they had proved that education is not just about letters and words, but about unlocking human potential. That love is not just about passion, but about seeing and cherishing the true essence of another person. That 2 broken, lonely people can find each other across all the barriers society erects and build something that outlasts their own lifetimes. Their descendants carried forward the values they had instilled. James's children became doctors and teachers. Caroline's became writers and artists. Thomas's became scientists and veterinarians. Each generation added their own achievements to the family legacy. But they all traced their success back to the night a mountain man knocked on a boarding house door and offered to teach a young woman to read. The general store where Grace had been humiliated eventually burned down and was replaced by a more modern building. But the boarding house, where Mrs. Henderson had chaperoned those first lessons, survived, eventually converted into a museum. The parlor where Grace and Garrett had fallen in love while studying grammar was preserved exactly as it had been, complete with the table where they had sat, and the chair where Mrs. Henderson had done her needlework. School children from all over Texas came to visit, to hear the story of the illiterate woman and the mountain man who loved her. Teachers used Grace and Garrett's story to inspire students who struggled, to remind them that circumstances do not determine destiny, that with determination and support, anyone can learn, anyone can grow, anyone can build a beautiful life. And so their legacy lived on, not just in their bloodline but in the countless lives they had touched and continued to touch long after their deaths. Grace had gone from being a woman who could not read a single word to becoming a symbol of the transformative power of education. Garrett had gone from being a lonely man hiding in the mountains to becoming an example of how one act of kindness can ripple outward in ways beyond imagining. Their love story was not one of instant passion or dramatic gestures. It was built slowly, carefully, night after night, lesson after lesson, moment after moment. It was built on respect and patience, on seeing past surface limitations to the truth beneath, on commitment that weathered every storm and celebrated every triumph. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest lesson they taught. Love is not something that happens to you. It is something you build deliberately and carefully with someone who believes in you even when you do not believe in yourself. It is patient teaching and eager learning. It is protection and strength, softness and vulnerability. It is choosing every single day to honor the promise you made when you first joined your lives together. Garrett had said he would teach Grace every single night, and he had. But in the teaching, they had both learned more than either could have imagined. They learned that two incomplete people can create something whole together. That shame can be transformed into pride, loneliness into belonging, ignorance into wisdom. They learned that building a life worth living requires both courage and faith, both independence and interdependence. And they learned that love, true love, is the greatest teacher of all. It taught them patience when they were frustrated, hope when they were discouraged, joy when they had every reason to despair. It taught them that their worth was not determined by what they could or could not do, but by who they chose to be. It taught them that home is not a place, but a person, that family is not just blood but chosen commitment, that legacy is measured not in wealth or fame but in love given and received. The sun set over the Texas prairie, as it had every evening for countless generations, and would continue to do so for countless more. The wind whispered through the grass and the oak tree on the hill, carrying with it the memory of every lesson taught, every promise kept, every moment of love shared between a mountain man and the woman who could not read. And if you listened carefully, very carefully, you might hear beneath the wind the echo of Garrett's deep voice teaching the alphabet, and Grace's softer voice repeating the letters, and the sound of two people building a love that would outlast time itself. One night, one lesson, one moment of faith and courage at a time. Their story was complete, their ending as good and full as any life could hope for. They had started with mockery and shame, with letters on a slate and patient lessons by lamplight. They had built from that foundation a dynasty of love and learning that would continue long after the last person who remembered them personally had also passed into memory. And that, perhaps, was the truest measure of their success. Not that they had loved each other, though they had, deeply and completely. Not that they had raised good children, though they had, with wisdom and care. But that they had created something larger than themselves, something that would continue to inspire and teach and transform long after their own story had ended. Grace and Garrett Grayson had proved that it is never too late to learn, never too late to love, never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. They had proved that one act of kindness, one offer to teach, one decision to see past surface limitations, can change not just one life but many. They had proved that love is built not in grand gestures but in quiet consistency, in showing up every single night, in keeping promises even when it is difficult. And they had lived, fully and completely, building a life together that honored both their individual strengths and their combined power. They had transformed mockery into triumph, shame into pride, loneliness into belonging. They had taken nothing and made it everything. In the end, what more could anyone ask of a life well lived? They had loved deeply. They had taught others to love. They had left the world better than they found it, and they had done it all together, hand in hand, lesson by lesson, night after night, until the very end and beyond. Their story was finished, but its echoes would continue forever, carried on the wind, preserved in memory, living on in every person who heard their tale and decided that they too could overcome their circumstances, that they too could learn and love and build something beautiful, that they too could keep promises that transform not just their own lives but the lives of generations yet to come. And so Grace and Garrett Grayson rested together beneath the oak tree, their work complete, their love eternal, their legacy secure. The mountain man and the woman he had taught to read had written together a story more beautiful than any contained in all the books Grace had devoured throughout her long, full life. And it was a story with the very best kind of ending, a love that lasted, lessons that endured, and a family that would carry their values forward into a future they could never have imagined but had helped to create. The sun set. The stars emerged. The wind whispered through the grass. And two souls who had found each other across the barriers of shame and loneliness rested in peace, together at last and always, their story complete, their love immortal, their promise kept. Every single night just as he had said, every single night just as they had lived, forever.